بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الفاتحة بنيتنا وأسلافنا الصالحين وبأن الله ينور قلوبنا وقوالبنا مع التقى والهدى والعفاف والغنى والموت على دين الإسلام والإيمان بلا محنة ولا امتحان بحق سيد ولد عدنان ولكل نية صالحة وخصوصا إلى حضرة سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا رسول الله محمد بن عبد الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وإلى روح ساداتنا الصوفية أينما كانوا في مشارق الأرض إلى مغاربها إلى أرواح الأئمة المجتهدين والعلماء العاملين وصوفية المحققين وأهل الذكر والتوحيد ومشايخ هذه الأمة بأن الله يتغشاهم بالرحمة والمغفرة ويعني درجاتهم في الجنة وينفعنا بأسرارهم وأنوارهم وعلومهم ونفحاتهم في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. For those who are watching, just a bit of a test. If you can hear me, please make some sort of a sign. Anyways, we continue again our discussion, which is based on the writing of our teacher, our esteemed teacher, Professor Wan Muhammad Nur Wan Daud, the educational philosophy and practice of Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Atas. Just a recap, we began with a discussion on the metaphysics of Islam, which serves as the grounding position of all sorts of activities, including educational activities in our worldview. We then proceeded to deal with one particular aspect of the worldview, which is extremely important with regards to teaching and learning, and that is the very concept of knowledge itself, its sources, pertaining to its definition, its importance and value. And then in the week that followed, of course, after having dealt with the question of knowledge, then comes the question of imparting knowledge, which is the process of education. So we went through the definition of education as espoused by Professor Naqib Al-Atas based on his process of intellection, which is in turn based on the Islamic intellectual tradition, which is sourced from the Quran. Then in the last discussion, we dealt with the institution or the systematic inculcation, which is the university, the concept in terms of idea as well as reality of the university in Islam. So in this present discussion, we then proceed to discuss on the matter of education itself, meaning to say what is it that is being transpired and how is it to be transmitted. In other words, we are now dealing with the problem of, or we are dealing with the question of curriculum content and educational methods. Methods, as we know, denotes the notion of a path or a way to arrive at something. As for curriculum content, we want to know in roughly what is the focus of the content of Islamic education. We know that the basic content, as we discussed from the previous weeks, of Islamic education is adab or akhlaq. The Prophet ﷺ was sent, no doubt, to perfect human adab or to perfect human akhlaq, and this certainly involves a number of things, which means amongst others, it includes the acquisition of good qualities and attributes. It includes the recognition and acknowledgement of the right and proper places of things. And then thirdly, it involves actions to discipline the mind and soul. And finally, it involves the performance of correct and proper action as opposed to erroneous and improper ones. Adab will imply knowledge and right methods of knowing, which preserves man from error and disgrace, and by which the condition of being in the right and proper place is actualized. Now, this notion of the proper places of things is unveiled, is revealed, is displayed in the Quran. because the system that the Quran projects, as we know, takes into consideration that the source or the author of the Quran is also the same author of the universe, the creator of mankind, who knows that which he creates in terms of that which is manifest and hidden. And he communicates with mankind via revelation. And this communication, which is found in the form of the Quran, reveals to us the relative values and the realities of things. Because the Quran begins with a survey of the ghaib as well as the shahada. The ghaib is the unseen, hidden reality, and the shahada is the realm of sense and sensible experience. Now this realm of these both realms, the realm of the alamul ghaib wa shahada, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is its perfect knower. Alimul ghaibi wa shahada. He is the one who knows both the hidden and the seen realities. And man has been created with sufficient equipment, shall we say, in terms of his internal as well as external senses, to discern and to know what he must from both realms, the hidden and the seen. As for the unknown, which is or unseen, it includes also knowing things such as the fact that the world did not originate out of nothing, that it was created by God. It includes knowledge of man's ultimate destiny. It includes ethical realities, yes, and it includes certainly the belief in the afterlife, in the resurrection, in which all human actions will be judged accordingly. So therefore, this is the basic content of Islamic education. The basic content of Islamic education reveals to us the proper places of things to such an extent that it would preserve the person who possesses knowledge of this type from disgrace. And we then know how the Prophet ﷺ has this has commands and prohibitions which is enveloped within his sunnah. So what he commands, yes, wa ma atakumur rasul fakhuduhu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, whatever the Prophet gives you or commands, then perform it, take it. Wa ma nahakum anhu, and whatever he prohibits, then you should refrain. In another, because the Prophet is the messenger of God, but ultimately the source of all knowledge is God himself. Allah mentions sometimes, asa an tuhibbu shay'an, you may like something, but it is in fact bad for you. And conversely, you may despise something, you may detest something, but it is in fact good for you. Allah is the one who knows, and you know, yet you know not. So taking into consideration all these things, the content of Islamic education is designed, yes, the content of Islamic education is designed to produce the good man, because the good man is he who knows the limits of things, he who knows the usefulness of things. And we will see that this is reflected in the sunnah or in the seerah of the Prophet, wherein, for example, in order to establish the relative values of the akhirah compared to this world, there is certain injunctions in the Quran, whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins with the principles by saying that wal akhiratu khairu wa abqa. Indeed, the afterlife is better and it is more permanent compared to the life of this world, although they prefer the life of this world. Bal tu'thiruna al-hayat ad-dunya. Now this principle being given, certain actions then will reflect accordingly whether or not you have internalized the principle. So certain actions, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ was giving khutbah, there was an occasion in which when he was giving khutbah on the day of Friday, a caravan of trade appeared. Yes, and while he was giving the khutbah, some of the audience left his company in order to chase the caravan, seeking, say, a profit of the nature of this world. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala corrects them when he said, وَتَرَكُوكَ قَائِمًا, and they leave you standing while they chase after the perishable goods of this world. So this is how gradually the Quran, as that acts as an educational process, the very content reveals to us that it is designed to produce good men and women. And certainly we find in the Surah Al-Ankabut, yes, and this is the month of Ramadan, which is meant for us to reflect on the content of the Quran and the process of education and the purpose and the outcome of the education. we will see that the Quran reveals, for example, in Surah Al-Ankabut, do the people who have iman, I mean to say those who have been taught about God, about the afterlife, those who believe in the things that they were taught, those who believe in the things that were brought by the Prophet Muhammad, do they consider that they will be left, yes, taraku, yes, without being tested, whereas the people of the previous generations were already tested. Now these are all considerations that we must take into mind when we discuss the content of Islamic education, which is certainly more prior than the method. Yes, it seems to be the predilection, it seems to be the preoccupation of many educational theorists, contemporary educational theorists, to prioritize methods of teaching as or what they call pedagogy, as opposed to the very content. It seems to be that what needs to be improved, what needs to imbibe elements of creativity and effectiveness is measured in terms of the delivery of the curriculum, and not to study the very content of the curriculum, which is the very purpose of education in itself. So, with regards to the Islamic intellectual tradition, while we prioritize the content, while the content is the purpose, it does not mean that the methods of teaching, the methods of learning is by no means important, because we know that method, or shall we say literally the path to arriving at something, denotes the notion that there are certain ways which are more effective than others. And this is the conception or the notion of a method is already evident in certain writings, such as the piece by or the treatise by Imam Al-Zarnuji, which is called the Ta'lim Muta'allim Tariq At-Ta'allum. So you see there the notion Tariq emerges, which is literally translated as the instruction for the student on the purpose or on the method of learning, I mean on the path of learning. So, and in the preface or in the introduction of that treatise, Imam Al-Zarnuji mentioned that amongst the purpose that drove him to write that treatise was because he saw that many students of knowledge fail to become accomplished scholars. In his time, he was making an observation of the many students in his time that failed to accomplish the purpose of knowing, or the purpose of the purpose of learning in Islam, or the purpose of education in Islam. And this is therefore, if we see the entire makeup of the work, Al-Zarnuji organizes in a systematic manner the ways in which one can increase the chances of mastering the sciences, increase the chances of becoming an accomplished scholar. And by that is not merely meant the external paraphernalia of scholarship, but ultimately the real purpose of knowledge, which he mentions as the most important starting point. Professor Wan proceeds in this chapter, after the recapitulation about the conception of adab in Islam, to discussing the foundation of the educational method, which he says as spiritual in nature. And this he summarizes based on the writings of course, Al-Zarnuji, as we already mentioned, but also At-Tusi, and more fundamentally Abu Nasr Al-Kharraz, based on his book, the Kitabu Sidq, the book of sincerity. So Professor Wan, highlighting the point made by Abu Al-Kharraz, which incidentally is also mentioned in Professor Naqib Al-Attas in several of his writings, with regards to the intellectual, or rather the sanad of the Sufis, which he mentions as being the source of some of his writings, like in the Intuition of Existence and several other parts in the Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam. Now, according to Professor Wan, citing from the above scholars, he mentions that the spiritual foundations of learning are to be encapsulated in three aspects. Of course, out of these three principles can emerge others and can be added several others, but these are foundational. The first is the intention, the niyyah. We know that the the very well-known hadith, which is quoted in several works, not only the major works of hadith, is the one that talks about the centrality of intention, wherein the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that actions are to be judged, are to be determined, are to be rewarded or punished based on their intentions. Innamal a'malu bin niyat. And then that for every individual, his achievement of what he earns is also based on what he has intended. And the Prophet ﷺ uses the experience of the hijrah to demonstrate this point. So whoever that made hijrah, and why, if we were to reflect, for example, why the occasion of the hijrah, the occasion of the migration, is the one that is considered as, shall we say, foundational, or in other words, as most demonstrative of the efficacy of, say, intention, is because migration involves difficult things, both externally as well as internally. During the time of the Prophet, when migration would mean leaving behind an established and regular way of life, which they have come to love. It includes leaving behind the town or the city that they love, which they grew up in. And the city that you grow up in will afford you privileges of social network, which is also understood as social capital and wealth, cultural capital and wealth. The city that they had to leave behind holds a high value for them, and especially because for some of them, the city that they left behind includes leaving behind their family and leaving behind their material possession, which they have worked so hard for to establish. So therefore, whoever that performs this act of hijrah, as the Prophet ﷺ is admonishing his companions, ought to do it for the best and the highest possible reason. So, as he said, whoever intends this hijrah for the sake of God and His Prophet, which is the only acceptable one, which is the highest intention, therefore he will obtain of that. And whoever that does the act for the world and whatever it contains, or for a woman, or for a beloved, in order that he may marry the beloved, then that is all that they will obtain. Certainly, of course, the world and its contents, yes, meaning to say material wealth and possession, is something that people would happily leave behind their hometowns. Many business people, many successful entrepreneurs have done this in human history. Conquerors have conquered lands in order for possession of the world. And similarly, many people also have left behind things that they love for the sake of marriage, for the sake of winning the hand of a person in marriage. But either the world or a person that you choose to marry, if that is your intention, then the world and then that is the extent of your achievement. It will not last forever. It will perish as the world will perish also. So certainly, we can use this to understand the act of acquisition of knowledge. Yes, because knowledge is the highest good possessible by man, because knowledge pertains to an attribute of his soul. Knowledge is the arrival of his soul at meaning, and the meaning which arrives in his soul. Knowledge will be his companion in the afterlife. Knowledge is the means through which he obtains the rida, or the contentment of his Lord. So certainly, in pursuit of knowledge, you must not intend to acquire knowledge for anything less than that. And this is shown in practice by Professor Naqib Alatas throughout the days of ISTAC, as documented in this very important book. Prof. Wan mentions that in some private discussions that Professor Alatas always informs him that he must tell the prospective students at ISTAC, and we can also attest as students in CASIS that Prof. Wan would continue in this manner, that he will advise students who want to study at CASIS, and previously Prof. Alatas advised those who want to study at ISTAC, that they ought to intend their study for the sake of God, for their love of knowledge, for their love of Islam, for their intention of understanding the profundity of this religion, how profound the teachings was, and to understand what Islam has produced, or what the civilization of Islam has produced in history. And also certainly Ihya ad-Din, the revivification of religion, and also the Ibqa ad-Din also, that it may continue to flourish in the world. That Istaq is built like a fortress of knowledge to defend against ignorance, and from time to time to disseminate this knowledge, because knowledge is ultimately the one that protects man from disgrace. So the intention of studying, therefore, has to be set, and it has to be pure. It has to be, as some of the scholars have summarized, first it has to be for the sake of the rida of God, to seek God's contentment, because to seek God's contentment is the highest possible goal. It is the meaning of happiness, because if God is content with the servant, then God will reward with the servant with the true nature of felicity and happiness. In this world, it means being given states, ahwal, being given states of feeling and emotions and spiritual states with regards to the soul and his Lord. The beginning would be ma'rifah, knowledge of him, but in its higher forms it includes, for example, fear and hope, having experiences of pining after him, mahabbah being its highest form. This is the reward of the servant who seeks knowledge for none other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, of course, the purpose of seeking knowledge, which is noble, pertains to the abolition of ignorance in oneself, the removal of ignorance in oneself, and also having discovered ignorance, in order to refrain from ignorance and to refrain from companies of those who espouse the ways of ignorance. And also, of course, as we mentioned already, Ihya ad-Din wa Ibqa ad-Din, and in order to defend the principles of religion and to ensure its practice in society. As for the second condition after say intention, it is sincerity. Now this is not easy, and this rarely is mentioned as a condition in say the university prospectus. As rarely do we find in studying in these days and age, especially because the dominant knowledge system in the world today does not consider knowledge as a spiritual experience. Knowledge as a spiritual experience. So therefore, when teaching no longer therefore prioritizes say sincerity. Now this siddiq, as defined by Professor Alatas, as siddiq, or truthfulness or sincerity, is understood as, or sincerity is understood as siddiq, yes, is understood as being a property of sentences, meaning to say a sentence can be considered to be true if it fulfills two conditions. One is that it is a statement that corresponds with facts. It is a statement that corresponds with the reality of the situation. Secondly, and this is more prior, because this involves the innermost self, it involves the being true to that which you utter. And with regards to the sincerity which is required in the process of education, this latter is more is as important, if not more important, than being able to uncover the former, which is the being able to say things as they are correct. Professor Alatas highlights the verse of from the Quran, which is in Surah Al-Munafiqun, that talks about the hypocrites. إِذَا جَاءَ الْمُنَافِقُونَ, when if the hypocrites, when the hypocrites, they come to you and they say that you are indeed the messenger of God, God bears witness that you are indeed his prophet, but God also bears witness that they are indeed liars. So this already shows that in the Quran, this conception of truth holds this both internal and external component. In the case of the hypocrites, it is not that their statement was false. Their statement was correct, that in fact the Prophet was the messenger of God. But their deception, they are not being true to themselves, is what gives them the appellation hypocrites, and what made them receive the lowest ranking in the order of creation, because they are considered to be the darkul asfal. They will be punished by God by being placed at the lowest level of hell, and being the lowest level of hell for basically confounding the truth, or for distorting the truth, for pretending to be truthful, but on the other hand act in a manner that is detrimental to it. So the students of knowledge has to be truly sincere and has to watch that their external statements, which may be peppered with, say, sweet words, do not contradict their innermost self. And we know that, for example, in the story, or in the intellectual tradition of Islam, in the history of the religious tradition, our scholars were very concerned about inward sincerity. Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad, in some of his prayers, mentioned that he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make his internal self more beautiful, yes, sirri, his internal self more beautiful than his external self, and he asked that his external self also become salih, that it becomes good. Because the internal is ultimately the place of God's vision, meaning to say the place of God's observation, whether or not you are truthful. And the Prophet mentions in several places, Inna Allah la yandur. Indeed, God does not look at your external actions, because your external actions, despite of its importance, can sometimes be a mask of what is not truly inside you. And truly, as Prof. Wan would remind us several times in the experience of learning with him, that he mentions that some students of knowledge, if they are not sincere, they may be able to hide this deception for a period of time, until they become established, until, for example, they have a certain title, until they have a certain position, at which point they perform the act of betraying their teachers. Or when they see that there is another bigger opportunity, since they were not sincere to begin with, since their intentions were not correct to begin with, when the opportunity emerges, then that is when they will show their true colors, shall we say. Sincerity certainly is amongst the most important attribute in human leadership. Supposing we produce graduates who are not truthful, who are not sincere, whose intentions in seeking knowledge is false. Imagine if they were given positions of authority and power, they would wreak havoc in Muslim community, or in the world community at large. The ubiquitousness, or the spread of falsehood, or of basically not being truthful, will result in a deficit of trust in society. And if the society suffers from a deficit of trust, the society will suffer several catastrophes of both external and internal kinds. Thirdly, yes, having established the importance of intention, having established the importance of sincerity, then the student must be prepared internally with the attribute of patience, sabr, because this is certainly most apt for learning, because learning is not an easy process. Learning takes a long time. Learning involves correcting oneself, and learning involves the improvement of one's mind, of one's spirit, of one's soul. Remember, because learning in Islam involves all aspects of the human personality, and the more difficult, or rather the more subtle aspects of learning in Islam involves the purification of oneself. Remember, since knowledge is spiritual in nature, the first duty of the student in embarking on the shall we say the path of knowledge is to purify his inward self, because knowledge is light, which is given from God. So therefore, you must prepare yourself for that act. And certainly, with regards to the definition of sabar, it is the ability to endure, or it is the act of enduring that which you may dislike out of the knowledge that you possess. And this involves several categories. The aspects of sabar which is considered obligatory is the patience with regards to the commands of God. When God commands you, for example, to perform your daily obligation, it requires patience to train yourself to do that. To fast in the month of Ramadan is an exercise in patience, which is why it is said that the sabar is half of iman. Yes, because sabar is the one that trains your lower self to follow the commands of your Lord. The second aspect of sabar, which is equally, if not more difficult than the first, is to control oneself from the things which have been prohibited by God. And this certainly will protect you from disgrace, will protect you from the things that will lead to your destruction. Because God only prohibits that which is destructive to you. So God prohibits the things which are haram in the external sense. For example, that the Quran prohibits, say, murder, forgery, lying. The Quran prohibits betrayal of trust. The Quran prohibits corruption. The Quran prohibits alcoholism, or rather drinking alcohol or consuming intoxicants. It prohibits gambling and certain other acts which is detrimental not only for the individual, but for the individual as a member of society. But more subtle than that, the prohibition that one needs to bear with is how to not succumb, for example, to the whisperings of jealousy, the whisperings of envy, how to not succumb to arrogance, how to not succumb to avarice, how to not succumb to, say, overbearing pride, and other more destructive internal vices, which includes riya, yes, ostentation, seeking praise. So the student of learning needs to prepare himself, needs to prepare herself in the quest of learning with patience. And once you have these three components intact, yes, this is the foundation that upon which you can build the knowledge component. Upon completing that, then next in line, Prof. Alatas, or rather Prof. 1 in this chapter, talks about the importance of authorities, the importance of teachers. Certainly, because we know that the Quran being the principal source of the religion of Islam and our say cognitive, conceptual and intellectual tradition, it is first interpreted by the Prophet, who is its most perfect interpreter. The Prophet ﷺ then educated the first generation of his companions, and then this developed into a tradition of students and teachers. The interpretation either will be correct or false. We know that the Quran warns about the dangers of false interpretation, that those, for example, who possess sicknesses in their heart, or those who suffer, yes, from al-zayg, فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ, those who suffer from a sickness of their hearts, they will interpret the Quran according to their whims and desires. And this certainly is part and parcel of the problem of the corruption of knowledge. If we study from the wrong teacher, or if we allow ourselves, which had not been trained, which had not been prepared properly with the right type of say, spiritual training and control, then certainly it is not impossible that you may interpret the Quran so as to fit your whims and desires, thereby doing injustice to its proper intention, which Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has prescribed. You would run against the prescriptions of the Quran. And so to continue, choosing the right teacher is certainly foundational. Because choosing the right teacher would not only mean being able to listen to the most correct interpretation from a teacher who belongs to a line of learning, who himself has underwent the proper process of perfection, or the process of education. It also means that the teacher, if we are fortunate, would be a person who would understand his student in terms of the capacity. The teacher would advise the student on the most optimum path of development. We know from the history of our tradition that we read that many teachers was so instrumental in the career of the student. For example, we know of the case of Imam al-Bukhari, who had initially set out to become a faqih, to become a jurist. Wherein he was advised by his teacher, due to his amazing talents in memory and his, shall we say, industriousness. The teacher recommended that he shift his focus towards the study of hadith, and he then became Imam al-Bukhari, who became most accomplished, whose Sahih is one of the most important books that has ever been produced in our tradition. So similarly, if you come into contact with the right type of teacher, the teacher will advise you to will be able to advise you as to what you need. Yes, and this is where what the teacher does is shall we say, in this case, provide a limit for you. And limitation, as has been established in the Islamic in the worldview of Islam as part and parcel of the philosophy of science, limitation is certainly not a shortcoming, because we know that human beings live finite lives, and we have finite talents, and we have finite opportunities and capacities. Within the finitude, there is perfection that can be achieved, but you have to select properly what to actualize, which is why Aristotle said that to achieve one's goal is not as difficult as to determine which goal exactly is worth aiming for. And the teacher, having established a profound and intimate relationship with the student, will be able to advise, yes, at the very least, the student on what path of development that he should embark, which does not mean certainly that once he has accomplished, say, one position of the school. This is something also that Professor Naqib Alatas advises his students, that he said that a student, and this echoing certainly the great scholars of the religious tradition of Islam, that you must remain loyal to the teacher at least until the completion of the course, until you understand the uniqueness of one position. Otherwise, you will suffer the fate of being stuck in a labyrinth of several positions which are mutually conflicting, and you remain in a state of confusion. And in the case of some people, they remain worse, or they become worse than when they started, because now they have added their dimensions of, shall we say, confusion. But in the case of the person who follows the right advice of the teacher and begin with the sure position of something that which is known, which is added and augmented until the confidence within that style, within that position of that school or that tradition, he then can go on to mastery, and then gradually go on even into the comparative aspects of learning. So certainly this is part and parcel of the educational method, the teacher being an important component. So just as authority, authority is extremely important with regards to choosing teachers, authoritativeness with regards to books is also important. This Professor Alatas mentions that Ibn Khaldun was also of the same opinion, that reading, say, too many books on the same subject will only lead to confusion in the students. It would have been much better for the student to select, say, an authoritative author, an authoritative work in a particular discipline, because the authoritative scholar in a particular discipline would have encompassed the discussions and the issues of what is also found in the lesser books within a particular discipline. So we can see, therefore, that this is the role of method, meaning to say this is the role of what method does is that it makes your learning effective. Imam al-Zarnuji wrote an entire tract, as we mentioned, that talks about not only in the choice of teachers, He recommends, for example, that you are to seek the advice of the authority in your locality before embarking on your journey to seek knowledge. And this is a very important advice, because the authority within your locality would know, based on his preliminary, or rather based on his experience of the local population that you are expected to return to. He would know what is needed. He would know what type of science and knowledge to develop. And this is the ultimately the practical implication of the fardu kifayah. A scholar who knows what the society requires and what the society needs. And this type of advice is not limited, certainly, to just students of knowledge with regards to the religion of Islam. We know also that in the sciences, in the technological sciences, even in philosophy, if we do not do this preliminary study or preliminary survey of who are the authorities and your own local setting, it is not impossible that you may end up, say for example, becoming meaning to say, you may end up performing the research programs of other scholars whose research program bears no interest, no influence to you. So therefore, the criteria of authoritativeness in a scholar is not only, say, fame, is not only, say, a person's say citation in today's parlance, but it is you ought to seek the scholar, as Imam Al-Zarnuji mentioned, who is most learned, who is most pious. And then after having these two, which is most important, he also adds an akbarusin, and the one who is older, because the one who is older would have the benefit of experience also in choosing the right teacher. And certainly consultation, because consultation, as Imam Al-Zarnuji mentioned, the intelligent person, human beings are of several types. There are complete individuals and those who are half individuals. The complete individual is the intelligent person who consults. The half individuals is the one who is either intelligent but does not consult, or the one who is not intelligent but at the same time he consults. And the worst in this case, who amounts to nothing, is the one who is neither intelligent nor consults others. In shura, in consultation, is a command by God, which the Prophet ﷺ also habitually practiced throughout his life, and that which is habitually practiced by all the Khulafa ar-Rashidun. The practice of the consultation will lead to arriving at the best possible outcome, or it protects the decisions from, say, untested, meaning to say it ensures the best possible outcome, shall we say. Now these are the methods that has already been mentioned by Professor Wan. There's several more, certainly, if we were to consult the great works such as Imam Al-Zarnuji and even Imam Al-Ghazali's section on the adab of students. And just to reiterate one final point about the importance of choosing sincere teachers, teachers who are as your spiritual fathers. They will lead to your optimum road of development, because Imam Al-Ghazali also mentions in the book Ayyuhal Walad that the role of the teacher is like the gardener who removes from your soul of the outgrowth of weeds, the outgrowth of say several other organisms that would be destructive to your growth. Because certainly the long journey of knowledge, yes, how many people do not succeed in obtaining the goal of learning, although officially they may end up having say accomplishments in their certificates and in the official recognitions, but ultimately they may fail as human individuals. Now, as for the content, of course, we mentioned that the content of Islamic education is further subdivided into the fardu ain and the fardu kifayah, and we have dealt with this in the previous weeks. The fardu ain, as Professor Alatas mentions, is not a static category, but it is a dynamic category that takes always into consideration the requirements of the individual, first and foremost, meaning to say how the individual can live a successful life in this world with regards to his hereafter, meaning to say how he can perform all the duties that is obligated to him by God, and how he can avoid the prohibitions that Allah has prohibited for him. So therefore, for the sake of for the student, the study of the Fardu Ain, as Professor Alatas mentions, at the higher levels of education, at the higher institutions of learning, would also grow considerably, because it will now include studies into the nature of the universe, studies into the nature of the relationship between God and the universe, which is encompassed within the discipline of Kalam, within the discipline of Tasawwuf, or as metaphysics, and the study of Tasawwuf also as ethics in the more subtle components. It will involve also the study of, shall we say, the Quranic sciences in order to be able to derive proper understanding, because at the more serious levels, knowledge no longer becomes taqlid. I mean, you can begin your quest by trusting authority, but gradually the more accomplished students, the more serious students of learning, and those who wish to continue shall we say, the struggle of educating the next generation, they must be able to study the deeper components, the theoretical as well as practical aspects. They must study the hujjah, they must study the arguments, and so on, so that they stand on firm grounds. As for the Fardu Kifayah, which is translated as the studies whose obligation is for the sake of the sufficiency of the community, Professor Alatas mentions that this also is certainly a dynamic category, because knowledge of this nature is with regards to, say, the material life of the community and the organic requirements of the society, by definition would be something which is infinite. It will continue to grow. But roughly, it can be organized into, say, several important disciplines, which includes the human sciences. And the human sciences here, which includes the humanities, is of course, subjects such as history, culture, including, say, economics, politics. Now, these human sciences are very important for a student of knowledge who would become an important member of the society. If he was a policymaker, certainly he must understand the nature of culture in his community, and he would make better suggestions. And of course, it is insufficient to merely know the human sciences, although it is important, but he must also equip himself with sufficient degree of knowledge of the natural sciences, because the natural sciences is studied to understand the realm of nature. And the study of the natural sciences, or the philosophy of science in Islam, includes not only the study of, say, the material realm for the sake of understanding the relationship between one thing and another, but it includes also an axiological component, a component of ethics, or a component of values. The axiological component revolves around the study of the limits of the parameters of allowable human interference in human nature. In other words, study of the natural sciences must include human evaluation to such an extent that you do not create destruction in the realm of nature. So the study of natural sciences also would revolve around the study of the intricate and delicate ecosystems, so as to promote biodiversity and sustainability of human living, and to prevent destruction from the hands of human beings. There is, of course, also an applied component, certainly. Yes, the applied component would revolve around, the applied components of, say, the natural sciences and the human sciences. For example, the study of human psychology would include also, say, a practical or an applied component, such as the study of, say, therapeutic, or rather the arts of healing and the arts of the arts of healing and the arts of curing. The applied sciences, when it comes to nature, would also include, say, for example, the next category, which is the technological sciences, yes, which is used for the aid or for the human usage in this world. Then, of course, aside from this, which has already mentioned, Prof. Alatas also lists in this list of fardu kifayah, comparative religion, and it would be especially important in the world that we live in today, as we encounter people of different religions. And the purpose of the study of comparative religion as a fardu kifayah science, having already accomplished the fardu ain, is to understand, for example, points of, say, convergences, the ethical principles that we share with other religions, and to understand the sensitivities also, such that this is part and parcel of the command of the Quran, that we are not to, we are not to encroach upon the sensitive elements of, say, the adherents of other religions, because otherwise it would lead to a no holds barred sort of human living, and the system of human living in Islam would promote harmony and not create disharmony. Finally, or rather, the next component of the fardu kifayah is Western culture and civilization, and this also is part and parcel of the fardu kifayah of Islamic scholarship today. We cannot fail to study Western culture and civilization with regards to its growth in history, its conception of knowledge, its conception of the university, the prevalent spirit of Western culture and civilization, the growth of its philosophy. All these things are important because this is the primary or the dominant civilization which is involved in the spread of knowledge, and which is also involved in the problem that we suffer in the various realms today, and which we must engage with creatively in several disciplines. And then, of course, there are other aspects, such as the study of Islamic languages, the linguistic sciences, and this also in order not only to promote, say, proper diction and to promote the growth of Islamic sciences so as to capture and describe reality properly, but also for the growth of literature, which is in itself valuable for human civilization. And then finally, Islamic history, which for some would not only be fardu kifayah but also fardu ain, or elements of it. So having summarized this, we will then see that the difference between, say, the fardu kifayah as Professor Alatas has arranged it in this most dynamic fashion, compared to, say, the general education, which is usually described by the liberal arts program, is that the fardu kifayah in this case entails already or rather this fine balance between the fardu ain and the fardu kifayah involves the development and actualization of human individuals who can function properly within his society. As for the general education, now, I mean, you may, for example, choose to take subjects from several disciplines. You expose yourself to you invite yourself to this culture of learning so as to become a learned person. But being a learned person who is, say, cultured in the sense that you know music, you know theater, for example, different languages, and you may know, say, several disciplines, need not necessarily mean, or need not necessarily translate into useful action, need not necessarily translate into performing that which is needed by your community. And there are several instances in which it may even prove destructive, for example, because it creates arrogance, it creates distrust, it creates doubt for not being in possession of a proper framework of learning. Now, before we end, Professor Wan also discusses in this chapter the additional dimensions of the educational method, which is important to point out, and this includes the importance of language. Present-day science and present-day education tends to promote that kind of learning which will be conducive to the industrial needs. So therefore, language may sometimes not be put as an important priority. And certainly, we know that there is a crisis in the education system today, which follows the industrial model, in that, say there is a crisis in the humanities. They do not get enough funding, and certainly the religious sciences also likewise. But if we are able to restore the proper understanding of knowledge, which is the improvement of human beings, then language will need to be restored in its proper place, because language is the key to understanding many aspects of the religious tradition of Islam. And certainly, I think before we end, Professor Wan also discusses the importance of studying and understanding faculty psychology, which is part and parcel of, the understanding of human beings, and this also, of course, to promote the most effective means of learning. Faculty psychology entails the understanding that the human being is of several modes. Although his reality is spirit, but there is an aspect of him that is psychological, there is an aspect of him that is emotive, there is an aspect of him that is spiritual, and all these different aspects, they possess, shall we say, different faculties, or rather different equipment and powers to train and improve themselves. In addition to the 5 external senses which we are familiar in the day-to-day discussion, there are also the internal senses, which is things such as memory, retention, imagination, estimation, which admits of further discussion. But Professor Wan is saying, including of course some present-day scholars in the liberal arts tradition, they say that the proper study of faculty psychology is part and parcel of educational theory and educational method, because understanding faculty psychology will allow us to train properly the individual quotients, the individual abilities and capacities which can be developed in order to apprehend truth. And with that, I end our long discussion and invite our participants or those who are present to ask questions, or perhaps if you like to leave any comments, you're also welcome. Any questions? Yes, admittedly, this chapter is quite a long chapter, and it covers a lot of points. It will take some time to process it. But my intention in doing this series is to give you a sort of an overview of what is contained in the chapter, and develop some of these discussions, so that you may then proceed to read the book on your own and benefit considerably, because this this very substantive volume by Professor Wan is an academic work. So the reading and trying to understand and discern what is contained therein will require concentration, will require thinking and reflection, and this is also how we were taught when we studied at CASIS. Professor Wan always tells us to when reading his works, when reading Professor Naqib Alatas's works, that you must not simply just read it at a glance and consider that you have understood all that is contained, especially of Professor Alatas's writing, but inclusive also of the writings of Professor Wan, such as this work. You must develop the skill of reading a work such as this one, to see, for example, the bibliography, to see the footnotes, to see which authors he quotes. And these are all important, because this is the references which are provided, although they serve as the strengthening of his arguments, but it basically it is part and parcel of the work. And certainly education is a very serious and important element in our society. So therefore we must give ourselves time to study a serious work like this, and we must devote the proper type of attention which it deserves. I take it if there are no questions, we can adjourn our present day discussion. And for those of you who might have questions, you can still leave the questions in the for piecemeal. And inshallah, if I come across them, I'll try to answer some of these questions in our next discussion. I thank you everyone for your participation, and inshallah until we meet again next time. Did I miss any questions here? I don't think so. Okay then, inshallah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.